just focus on two related questions. One is the reasons why Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, and two, what are the likely consequences of this withdrawal? Now the question becomes why this position is taken. Now I will venture four major reasons or pressures that explain this reversal or removal of it. One explanation often given is that, of course, Trump wants to undo all of Obama's achievements. Second reason, a much far more important reason, is basically the pressure from Israel. A third factor that is important is the Saudis plus the United Arab Emirates. The fourth final reason for the pressure are basically a group of neocons, the people who brought us the great success of Iraqi liberation, are now in charge of very much the State Department, and they're fully now manning it with former neocons. And if you go back to their record, and there's no secret because they wrote a lot, there were no secret that their real enemy was in fact Iran. The phrases they used was Baghdad was the road to Tehran, that real men want to go to Tehran, not just to Baghdad, that they were out to destroy the Islamic Republic, and sometimes even more than that. If you look at deconstruct some of their statements, look at some of the maps they distribute about Iran, they see Iran as fragmented into a number of small sectarian mini-states. So their idea is not just the destruction of the Islamic Republic, it's more the destruction of Iran as an entity, because they see Iran as basically a state, a large enough state that could be a problem for the United States. Here, the old explanation would be, of course, it's U.S. imperialism wants to control the Middle East. Well, we don't use words like imperialism, it sounds old-fashioned, but if you look at it, a question of power, what you're seeing here is the United States wants to be the dominant, the hegemon in the Middle East. It can tolerate countries that submit to it, but if any country doesn't submit to it, then it has to be eradicated to teach others a lesson. This was true of Iraq, this was true of Gaddafi, it was true of Assad, and it's true of Iran now. So the idea is that Iran has crossed the United States, it has not obeyed United States, it has even vehemently opposed the United States. For the neocons, the way to deal with that is to actually destroy Iran or attack Iran. And added to this is that many of these neocons, especially Bolton, Gingrich, what you find in their recent past is they've been working very closely with the cult group called the Mujahideen, who they now prefer to use the MEK because the Mujahideen has other flavors to it, and they don't want to be associated with the so-called Muslim Crusaders, so they call themselves MEK. For a long time, the MEK was categorized as a terrorist organization by the United States. It's no longer categorized that, and I don't like the term terrorist because it's sort of obviously a loaded term and has many different aspects. But it's clearly a cult organization, a religious cult, where its members basically obey anything its leader tells them to. To give you one example, one morning the head of the Mujahideen, Rajavi, he's considered the imam among them, imam of the present age. He got up and told everyone that was a member had to divorce their wives. And then they could remarry, but he would appoint who was to be your next spouse. So what could be more cultish than this? Now this cult, for a long time, got a lot of money from Saddam Hussein. It actually fought Iran on behalf of Saddam Hussein. When Saddam Hussein fell, it then got its contacts with the Saudis. It now gets unlimited funds from the Saudis. So it is able to have basically a lot of cash to spread around, and it organizes every year major meetings in Paris, where you see actually interesting figures from the United States appearing there, including Gingrich, Bolton, and so on. Bolton apparently until now was getting $40,000 a year from the Mujahideen. Then there are also the royalists from the monarchists from the old regime in the United States. They also want to get into power into Iran. Obviously they can't do it on their own. What they want is the United States to do their deal. They're like the Chalabis and Makirs of the Iraqi crisis. They want basically an occupation of the country where then they would be brought back and the restoration of the monarchy. And the Mujahideen want, of course, the Mujahideen. In fact, just a week before Trump withdrew from the deal, Bolton spoke to a Mujahideen meeting in Washington, and he promised them by this time next year you will be celebrating in Tehran. And here is the future State Department head making a promise to a cult that they're going to be in power in Tehran within a year. So these things are not a secret. These are basically all in the open. Now, what the argument of the neocons and the people who have designed this strategy of withdrawal is the argument that the logic is that if you put very strong sanctions on Iran, economic sanctions, the system is going to crumble. Why? Because it is weak, it is a failed state, it's a dictatorship, it's corrupt and everything else. And all you need to do is a little huffing and puffing, bring in some sanctions, and the system will crumble on its own. And this is basically a false premise. Again, it's very similar to the Iraqi thing that once US moved in, people are going to greet the liberators as they're bringing their freedom. Here the notion is that there is so much resentment, opposition, criticism of the regime in Iran that a little basically tightening of screws is going to bring the whole thing down. The problem with that premise is that although in Iran there is a lot of problems, there are, when you look at human rights issues, it's very mixed, it's very bad on individual rights, but when you come to actually a question of social rights, it's pretty good actually over the last 30 years. The regime, how one dislikes it not, has achieved a tremendous amount in terms of expansion of education, medical facilities, electrification, road building, housing, slum clearance. If you look at the budget under the Shah, 18% of the budget went to the military. Now 4% of the budget goes to the military. The reason is much of the oil resources for the last 30 years have gone into social programs. So, however, you be critical of the regime on individual rights, when you look at statistics such as education, especially health, life expectancy in Iran now is better than the United States. It's not saying much, of course. It's not saying much, but it is saying much if you compare it to before the Islamic Revolution. So although people might have objections, criticisms of the regime, on the whole, people are not so opposed to the regime that they want a return of the monarchy, or they want the coming to power of a cult group like the Mujahideen, who are even more strict about Islamic codes and stuff than the Islamic State is. Another factor that is very important to understand the regime is not fragile is Iran is not an artificial state created by colonialism and imperialism in the 19th, 20th century. Iran, unlike most third world countries, is much more like China, not as big as China, but it has a long history, not as long as the 10,000 of the instrument, but 2,500-year history. So this has created a strong national identity. It's not a system that's going to collapse or break off like Iraq did, because there is a strong Iranianism or Iranian identity. And this identity is reinforced not just by a long history, but there is the Zoroastrian culture that actually seeps into folk culture and is still very important. Then you have, on top of that, you have Shia Islam that again creates a much more of a homogeneous society. And then, and these whole things actually undermine the notion that nation states are a new creation of the West. Iran and China especially don't fit into that category. There's a long you can say, history that has created a strong national identity. And then if you look at recent events, 20th century events that have added to this national cohesion. So Iranians may often conflict about politics, but there is strong still identity and common history that bonds them together. Just to give you two recent events that have done that. One is the 1953 coup. This 1953 coup is a major event for Iran because the reason for the coup was that Iran, under the popular Prime Minister Mossadegh, nationalized the main company, the British oil company. And this wasn't just an economic issue, this was a much more a national issue. Iran at that time was not colonized by the British, but it could be considered as a semi-colonial state, in that real power lay with the British and the British oil company. And by nationalizing the oil company, it was a way of Iran declaring its independence against the British, against the West. So Mossadegh wasn't just seen as a person who nationalized the oil company, but someone who brought independence to Iran by throwing out the British oil company. And this was how it was seen actually both in Iran and Britain in 1951 when the oil company was nationalized. When he was overthrown by the CIA, this was seen as a reversal, a great undermining of national sovereignty, national independence. This was more than just a change of a government, a coup. It was seen as going back to a semi-colonial period, except for now United States replaced Britain as the imperial power. So this becomes a dominant event in recent Iranian history. And when you move forward to the 1979 revolution, again, some common factor that affected most Iranians, whether they liked it or not, it becomes a central event of 20th century. The revolution was not just an Islamic revolution, it's termed an Islamic revolution. It was also a national revolution because the masses of people who participated in it saw this as a way of regaining independence that was lost in 1953. This was like a reversal of the coup, going back to the Mossadegh era of becoming independent again. Except for here, the enemy was no longer Britain, it was much more United States, because the United States was seen as the power behind the Shah and the monarchy. And this revolution actually is a major phenomenon in modern history. If you look at the mass participation in the revolution, it's been estimated it had more per capita mass participation than any other revolutions, including the French or the Russian Revolution. It really participated, brought in the millions of people into the street, all crying down with the Shah, get rid of the Shah, and also implicit in that was get rid of the United States, because the United States was seen basically as the power behind the Shah. So these events have all actually, I think, created in Iran a very strong national awareness, a national consciousness that is not going to be brought down just by sanctions and huffing and puffing in Washington. Added to all this is another factor that people try to minimize, especially in the United States, because the state in the United States is often considered the problem, the enemy. In Iran, actually, the state is seen as this place that you get aid that supposed to provide certain beneficiaries, sort of social services. And the Iranian state, despite all its problems, is actually been very effective as a bureaucracy. If you look back during the Iraqi war, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, 8-year war, Iran's economic crisis was very acute. The oil prices also hit rock bottom. I think they fell something from $40 a barrel to about $6 a barrel. The country was really on its legs economically, but the state survived by introducing a very effective rationing system, distribution system. There was an efficiency bureaucracy to do that, very much like Britain during World War II. And this is something that is very important when you're looking at so-called failed states. Failed states don't have effective states. In Iran, there is an effective state, and it can deal with some economic hardships. So, what's the likely outcome once these U.S. has withdrawn and imposed strict sanctions? Well, the expectation is that the regime would crumble. I'm arguing the regime is not going to crumble. So what's the next stage? Okay, the Iranian side has alternatives. And the Iranian state actually is, and even in decision making, is quite rational and even more actually rational than the present American state. In foreign policy, decisions are not made by the supreme leader. There's a National Security Council that advises him, that discusses this. And in the council are basically the heads of all the major institutions, the army, the foreign ministry, the presidency, the economic sectors. They all have an input on how to deal with it. So when the Trump ultimatum came, I think Trump expected them to read it as a declaration of war and basically say, well, US has declared war, we're going to go to war with the United States. This is something what the neocons would want. Actually, they kept their cool. They said, well, our agreement is not just with the United States, it's with the United Nations and the 5+1. We will negotiate as if it is with Europe, with China and Russia. And basically puts the ball in their court to see what they're going to do. So they didn't act irrationally, but highly, you could say, calculated in a diplomatic way. The problem now is then, how are the other countries going to react? Europe has obviously objected to Trump's actions. They have objected to the threats of penalties on European companies trading. But they're unlikely to actually go confront United States on this issue, for the obvious reason that most of the European companies do more trade with the United States than with Iran. So if they have to face the choice, they would obviously have no choice but to prefer United States. What they might try to do is to basically find some seepage, some agreement with the Trump administration that certain goods could be sold. There could be basically agreement. There was limitations on what they would do, so that this would water down the pain of the sanctions. But this, of course, then would undermine the real aim of the sanctions is to hurt the regime as much as possible. So there's at the moment the negotiations between the Europeans and America about how are the sanctions going to be implemented. Iran could also do another thing while they're waiting, hoping that Europeans will actually deliver, but also they're realistic enough to know that Europeans can't deliver. So what will they do? And this will then open up Iran to real politics. Iran, unlike some of countries such as the Gulf countries, does have politics. It has elections every 4 years for presidency, for parliament, for local councils. And although these elections are not completely free, they're not completely free in any country, but in Iran there's always very real competition between the so-called moderates and more conservatives, right-wing fellows, people who could be seen as a mirror image of Trump, like the former president Ahmadinejad was very much that character. So there is competition, and it could very well be that in these elections, the people who will come to power are more hardliner allies, not Ahmadinejad himself, but some cronies of him. And they would be much more basically active, much more intransigent. And they could easily say, well, we always told you so. They're always saying, don't trust America. They're always going to try and cheat you. They always oppose the deal in the first place. So they say, history has proven right. The moderates were wrong to even negotiate with Obama. Pull out. And they have a right to pull out since already the United States has pulled out. So they'll say politely to the UN inspectors that, we no longer need you, please leave. They will have no choice to leave. And then the world is not going to know what's going to happen inside the nuclear installations. This was, of course, a nightmare for Obama. If you have no inspections, then Iran could be easily developing or going towards developing a bomb. So once the inspections are thrown out, then the danger is that Iran is then on the fast track to building nuclear bombs. Then the question becomes, what does US do or Israel does? Then the temptation would be to actually start bombing the nuclear installations. There's no other choice, but that may not solve the problem because some of the nuclear installations are hidden well underground. And also, by bombing, it's going to unify the country and make the country actually more intransigent rather than change of regime. So they might get a change of regime, but not the type they wanted. They will replace the Rouhani government that's fairly moderate with a much more die-hard right-wing regime. They should be careful what they wish for when it comes to this. So the bombing will not then really solve the problem. You'd have then have to have more bombing to give more pay, maybe urban bombing of cities. That's not going to solve, because in most, we know it from history, when you bomb a country, it doesn't bring down the government, it strengthens the government, because even people, critics of the government, are then rally behind the government. Then down the road, they have to face the question, the only way then they could solve the problem is actually invade the country. And if you think that Iraq was a mess, you just have to realize the size of Iran and the situation in Iran is much different. Iraq had a population of 23 million. It was a highly divided society. The Kurds, in fact, supported the US invasion. The US had to use 400,000 troops to occupy the country, and that wasn't enough, actually. If you're going to occupy Iran, a population of 80 million, which is a much more solidified population, it really needs more than 1 million troops. This would really mean actually the return of conscription national service to form an army to have such an occupation. So it basically becomes a nightmare, a sloping nightmare into a drastic situation. Obama actually just last week said in a statement when he read about the Trump thing, he says, without the deal, the US could eventually be left with a losing choice between a nuclear-armed Iran or another war in the Middle East, which I think is a realistic assessment of the future. So I'll stop there.